this all mean going forward? Well, first of all, there's this enormous legacy of debt that's being created by the stimulus packages and the other interventions. And the debt to GDP ratio is rising rapidly. I say debt to GDP. Why I say debt to GDP? The GDP is kind of a measure of our capability, our earnings capability, our productive capability in the United States. So if you take the total debt and divide it by GDP, it kind of gives you a measure of how capable we are of servicing our debt. So people frequently say, what's the debt to GDP ratio in Greece, the United States? Greece is 115%. In the United States, at the end of the Reagan administration, it was 40%. In the United States, at the end of the Reagan administration, 40%. At the end of George W. Bush administration, 40%. It's now projected in 2018 to be 100%. And before I finish this percentage business, in 2083, that's a long way away, I agree, 700%, unless we change our laws, unless we deal with these entitlement programs. If I could show you the chart, you'd be blown away. We have basically debt to GDP ratio in our history. It goes up and down. Usually goes up in war. So it went up in World War I, went up in World War II. World War II got to 100%, and it came down. So it's 100% again. 700%, you couldn't even see it. As Damon was saying, I lecture freshmen at Stanford. I showed them this chart, the second lecture last fall. And I'm not quite sure they really saw how dramatic it was. So I decided, well, to illustrate this thing, I bring my granddaughter to help guest lecture. There's a guest lecture. There's my granddaughter. I figured she'd still be around in 2083. Hope so. Well, she was only 5 months old. So I brought her in and opened my arms. And fortunately, she looks up at the chart. And she looks over at my ear. And she said, fix it. She was just perfect. Just it's the best guest lecture ever. But the truth is, this is an amazing problem that we've had. We've dug ourselves into a hole. And this great deviation has not helped it. The monetary policy also is problematic because not only did we get off track, as I mentioned in my first point, but we now have this huge overhang of money that's created. And somehow the Federal Reserve has to pull that back out of the system, sell those mortgage-backed securities, for example, without causing the economy to slow down. So it's risky. And if it doesn't pull that money out, we've got high inflation down the road for sure. When it will come, I can't predict, but unless there's a change in the policy, we're going to have inflation like back in the 1970s, or even more. Just there's an inconsistency in the system that has to be resolved. About that, not only high debt, high interest rates, burden for our future, burden for our country, but also the inflation that goes with it. People have sometimes asked me, well, how harmful is that debt anyway? Well, it reduces our growth rate. As it gets over 100%, there are risks of more recessions. We can look in Europe and get some information about Greece. The Greece debt to GDP ratio is 115 right now, 115. So I said, ours is going above that, unless we make corrections pretty soon. So it's not unreasonable to think about an analogy with what's happening in Europe. The policy implications, to me, are very straightforward. Get back on track. What does that mean for fiscal policy? It means stop the debt-creating, basically wasteful stimulus packages. It means reforming the entitlement programs. It means stopping this extra growth of the entitlement programs so that our debt doesn't keep increasing so much. It means not adding more entitlement programs. This is a serious problem. And foreign policy is effective. Our Secretary of State and our Secretary of the Treasury has had to go to China to say, please buy our debt. And that's tough. That's your foreign policy. I was in the Treasury for 4 years under President Bush, 2001, 2005. We would never think of telling the Chinese to buy our debt. We told them to sell our debt. We don't need you. We don't need you to buy our debt. But it's changed because the debt is so big. It's just really very hard to debt is a major problem. That's the fiscal policy implications. The monetary policy implications are actually pretty simple, and that is to get back to the policy that was working, starting in the 80s, starting with President Reagan and his support of Paul Volcker, continuation with Alan Greenspan through most of that period. Get back to that. It was working well, and that's what I hope we're going to do. So, so this is kind of a pessimistic talk. But I have a smile on my face. I have a smile on my face because I see you here. And it seems to me something's different in this country. I think a lot of people are realizing that these are serious, this is a serious situation. There are serious problems that we're facing. Arithmetically, they're easy to solve. Some of them are really not difficult to solve at all, such as Social Security reform. So there's a real hope, it seems to me. I've never seen it like this before. I look at the polls, the distrust in government is the highest it's ever been. People really want to have some kind of change. And if the people there now can't make the change, then we have to get people who will make the change. And the more people like yourselves do that and get out and understand the facts. And again, to me, it's not a partisan issue. I've been critical of, as critical of the Bush administration here, not as critical as the Obama administration, but I've had to not hesitate to say when things are good and when things are bad. That's what I think we have to be focusing on. It's not partisan, but it's something that is a real problem right now in our government. I think largely it's being made worse by the things that are going on in the current administration. So anyway, the news at the end seems to me is good. Wear those ties. Democracy is not a spectator sport, and we'll be okay in the end. Thank you.
Professor Taylor, if you'll take some questions.
Absolutely.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So if you have a question, we'll...
Jack, before you start, just from past history, we would like questions, not speeches.
Okay. Do you all agree to that? Yes, questions. All right, we'll start. First, gentlemen, would you give your name?
I'm Dave Chapman. I'm running for Congress against that issue. My question is, given the international nature of the dollar, the fact that the dollar is the global reserve and settlement currency, the Fed has entered into about $150 billion worth of swap agreements with foreign central banks. Chairman Bernanke says that this is not going to be a permanent part of our policy. Do you think he's wrong?
Well, I guess I have to take him at his word. He doesn't want it to be part of our policy. But let's think about it a little more deeply. Maybe give this recent example. The swap loans to foreign central banks actually began in December 2007, way back then. They didn't do much good for quite a while. A lot of data to show that. Then you have, during the panic period, they increased quite a bit. And then they came back to zero. Okay, so at that point you could say, we don't need to use the swaps anymore, it's finished, it's ancient history. Lo and behold, just 2 weeks ago, the ECB gets more swap loans as part of their operation. So it seems to me that's an indication and a worry that despite the best intentions here, we're in a world where these kinds of things are more normal. You know, this used to be very unusual. Swap loans for this kind of purpose. These kinds of actions, these extraordinary actions of the Fed were very unusual. Now you worry that they're becoming commonplace. And that's not getting back on track, it's staying off track. And so I think that, again, when you analyze policy, you have to think of what the nature of the Fed is. The Fed is an independent agency of some kind, but the chairman is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The other members are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So all those things come into play when you analyze in the future what the Fed will do. So you have to do more than listen to what they say and look at the things I just mentioned, which I think does indicate that this, unfortunately, looks like a continuing